Have you ever sat in the dark at 3 in the morning, when your phone is off, when the world outside has fallen asleep, when all the roles you play during the day have been shed like a coat that's too tight, and you're left alone with the rawest question a person can ask themselves? How much am I worth, and who gets to decide that? I've had nights like that. And on those nights, I used to believe the answer lay in things that could be counted, displayed, printed on a business card, and placed on the table during meetings with partners. I used to believe a person's value was the sum of their title, their income, their degrees, and their position on the invisible ladder that society had built long before I was born. Who was on top, who was at the bottom, who deserved to be heard, and who should just stay silent. I used to see the world through that lens, and I'm not proud of it, but I don't deny it either, because denying your own past is like betraying the person who led you to where you are today. But then I met Elena. It was an October afternoon in Portland, the city of unhurried rain, of fiery red maple trees lining the streets, and of old coffee shops where you can sit for hours just watching the rain fall. I met her in a free accounting class at the Multnomah County Library, where she volunteered to teach immigrant women how to manage the books for their small businesses. She wasn't the kind of person you'd notice immediately in a crowd. Not loud, not flashy, not trying to fill the space with stories about herself. But there was something in her deep brown eyes that I couldn't look away from, a strange stillness like the surface of a lake after a storm, as if she had walked through something immense that no one ever knew about. It wasn't until much later that she told me. That day, in a small coffee shop on Flanders Street, with bare brick walls and the smell of roasted coffee mingling with old books, she ordered a black tea, no sugar, no milk. Her fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, her eyes fixed on the window where raindrops were streaking down the glass, and in a voice so calm it sent a chill down my spine, she said the words I will never forget. He called me temporary, while living on the money I earned, while sleeping on the sheets I bought, while dreaming dreams funded by every dollar of my salary that I poured into a future he never intended to share with me. She didn't cry when she said it. No trembling, no tightening her grip on the teacup, no closing her eyes to hold back tears like I'd seen others do. And that very calmness was the most terrifying thing, because it told me she was no longer in the storm. She had passed through it long ago, and now she was just recounting it like a witness describing a closed case, with all the clarity and coldness of an accepted truth. I want to tell you her story. Not to make you angry, though I know you will be, because anyone with a heart in their chest would be angry hearing what I'm about to tell you. But I don't want that anger to be a flame that flares up and then dies out in a few seconds as you scroll to another video. I want it to smolder like a red coal beneath the ash. I want that after the story ends, you'll sit quietly for a moment and ask yourself the question I asked myself the night I met Elena. Have I ever unintentionally treated someone as a means to an end? Have I ever judged a person by those invisible hierarchies without even realizing it? And if one day all the flashy, external things were stripped away, what would be left that is truly my worth? This is not my story, and I won't pretend it is, but I tell it with all the respect for the woman who trusted me with the broken pieces of her life. I tell it as if I'm sitting next to you in that same coffee shop, under that same warm yellow light, and I'm speaking to you in the voice of a friend who has been wrong, who has been blind, who once saw life through a distorted lens, and is learning to see it again with different eyes. Because if there's one thing I learned from Elena, it's this. A person's true worth isn't found in the numbers on a paycheck. It isn't in the title printed on a business card. It isn't in what others call them, or what class they're assigned to. It lies in something deeper, quieter, and far more enduring. Something she had to trade 4 years of her life to find, and once she found it, no one could ever take it away from her again. This is the story of how she found it. Their apartment was on the second floor of an old wooden house on a gentle slope in the Selwood neighborhood, in southeast Portland, where old maple trees stood silently by the road says, like old soldiers who have monotonous stone steps, where green moss, coffee from the bakery down the street, seep through every crack in the door each morning. It was a space not as glamorous as the gleaming glass penthouses downtown, but not as bleak as the forgotten buildings on the east side. It was simply a place to live, a place Elena had chosen because it had a large window that looked directly into the canopy of a maple tree over 40 years old. And in the fall, when the leaves turned a brilliant red, she would often sit for hours by that window with a cup of tea in her hand, silently watching each leaf twirl in the wind before landing on the wet street below. The staircase leading to the apartment creaked under every step, a sound so familiar she no longer heard it. But later, when everything had changed, she would remember that sound as part of the peaceful days she didn't know were about to end. The oak door with paint peeling in the bottom right corner, the gray doormat with frayed threads, and the brass wind chime she hung on the small balcony. The one Derek never noticed, but Elena still dusted it every weekend, just because she liked its gentle, tinkling sound whenever the wind blew. The apartment was leased in her name alone. The contract, signed April 12, 2019, with Elena Vasquez's neat signature at the bottom of the page, was something she never thought of as an important fact until much later, when everything had fallen apart. Because for the entire 4 years she lived there, she always considered it our home, a plural she used with all the sincerity of someone who had never learned to distinguish between what she gave and what others took for granted. Elena Vasquez was born in a small town near McAllen, Texas, where the Mexican border was just a few miles away, and Spanish mingled with English in every conversation at the market, at school, at church every Sunday morning. She was the daughter of a mother who worked as a nurse for 30 years in a county hospital, and a father who was a plumber, people who never complained about their lives, even though life had never been generous to them. People who woke up at 5 in the morning every day, worked until evening, and came home with calloused hands and a calmness that Elena inherited like an invisible family heirloom. She was a woman of numbers, and that's not a metaphor. She truly loved numbers, loved how they never lied, loved how an Excel spreadsheet could tell her the whole truth about a business, a family, or a life with just neatly arranged columns and rows. And during her 6 years as an accountant for a local food distribution company based in Tigard, she had built a quiet but solid reputation. Elena was the person you called when the numbers didn't add up, when the balance sheet was off, when there was a tiny error somewhere that no one could find. And she would sit down with her black tea, no sugar, and trace every line, every calculation, until the truth emerged, clear as water. She had a quiet beauty, the kind you only notice when you've sat next to someone long enough to see the small details others usually overlook. Thick black hair always tied in a low ponytail with a simple elastic band. Deep brown eyes that had a habit of looking a little longer than usual at things that interested her, and hands that always had ink stains from the ballpoint pens. She used to constantly jot notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere, a habit she'd kept since high school. But beneath that quiet and calm exterior was an old wound she had never named, a fear of abandonment that flowed silently through her veins like an unseen underground river. It was a fear inherited from her mother, Maria, who had stayed with her husband for 30 years, despite never once hearing him say thank you, who had bent down to pick up every dirty high sock, cooked every hot meal, and silently endured the baseless anger of a man who saw his wife's sacrifice as a given, like the sun rising every morning. And Elena grew up believing that love was endurance, it was duty, it was staying, even when staying hurt you. Because leaving was failure, leaving was selfish, leaving meant you weren't patient enough, weren't forgiving enough, weren't good enough. Derek Harlow entered Elena's life like a strange wind in the middle of a sweltering summer, bringing with him all the vibrancy she never dared to have, and that was the trap. Because quiet people are often drawn to those who shine, like moths drawn to a flame, not knowing they are about to be burned. And Elena, for all her intelligence and the clear-headedness of a skilled accountant, didn't see it until it was too late. Derek was born in the suburbs of Bellevue, east of Seattle, to a family that once had money, or at least had the appearance of a family with money. His father was a real estate broker who went bankrupt after the 2008 crisis, and his mother was a woman who spent her life under the illusion that she belonged to a higher class than she actually did. Derek inherited from her that persistent belief, the feeling that no matter how bad the present was, he was still different, still above, still belonged to a world that people like Elena were only allowed to visit, but never truly belonged to. Derek's current job was building a startup, a line he had repeated for 3 consecutive years with the same optimistic tone, the same confident smile, the same promising pat on the shoulder at every partner meeting in dimly lit bars on Pearl Street, even though that startup had never had a product, never had revenue, never had anything other than a bare-bones website and a box of glossy business cards that Elena had paid to have printed for the 3rd time after Derek decided to change the company name because the old one didn't sound powerful enough. He was charming. That was a fact no one could deny. Derek had a smile that made you want to believe him even when your gut told you something was wrong. He talked like a man of the future, always with a grand plan, a long-term vision, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity waiting just behind the next door. But after 3 years with him, Elena had learned something she never said out loud. Derek's grand plans never came with an Excel spreadsheet. They never had a cost column, a projected revenue column, or a contingency plan column, because in Derek's world, those trivial details were someone else's job. And that someone else was Elena. Derek's core flaw wasn't laziness, at least not in the conventional sense. He didn't lie on the sofa all day watching TV. He was genuinely busy, genuinely meeting people, genuinely talking about ideas and opportunities. But what he never did was value the ordinary. To him, a stable job was mediocre. Diligence was lacking ambition, and Elena's quiet kindness was having no vision. He had been raised to believe that some people were born to lead, while others were born to support. And in that invisible hierarchy, Elena belonged to the second group, the group of diligent, loyal, and useful people. The kind of people you need on your journey, but never invite to the table when the real party begins. They met on a sweltering July afternoon at a barbecue in Laurelhurst Park. It wasn't some fateful Hollywood meet-cute with dazzling lights and a soaring melody playing the moment their eyes met. It was simply a mutual friend named Kevin introducing them next to the drinks table. At the time, Derek had just left his old company 4 months prior and was in the finding a new direction phase. He spoke of big ideas with bright eyes and enthusiastic gestures, and Elena listened, truly listened, because she had never met anyone who dared to dream so big, never met anyone who spoke of the future with such certainty, as if it had already happened and was just waiting to be realized. He saw in her a piece that he lacked, an anchor in the chaotic sea of his ideas, debts, and unfulfilled promises. And she saw in him a vibrancy she had never dared to have, a fire she hoped would warm her instead of burn her. And within 2 years of that afternoon, they were married in a small ceremony with fewer than 50 guests at a lavender farm outside Hillsborough. Elena paid for most of the wedding because Derek was waiting on a payment from a partner. And as she signed the deposit check for the venue, Derek held her hand and said in the most sincere voice he could muster, "I'll pay you back 10 times over for this someday." And Elena smiled, because she didn't need 10 times back. She just needed someone to stay. Now, before I continue, I need to pause here for a moment because I know what you're thinking. I can feel the question forming in your mind as you hear the numbers I'm about to list. And I want you to know that I asked Elena the very same question when she told me all of this. I looked at her, unable to hide my confusion, and asked, "How could you let it get this far?" Derek's premarital credit card debt was $12,000, incurred from trips he called market research, from partner dinners at restaurants where the menus didn't even list prices, and from receiptless expenses for which he always had a reasonable explanation and a promise of repayment. There was an $8,000 personal loan from a college friend that was 14 months overdue, which Elena only found out about when the friend called her on a Tuesday morning, his voice awkward and apologetic. There was the car loan for the used 2016 Audi that Derek insisted he needed because, in my circle, everyone looks at what you drive. And those were just the debts. Not to mention the $1,450 a month for rent that Elena paid entirely from her account, the utilities, internet, and insurance also from her account, and the $400 a month for the private school of Derek's 11-year-old son from a previous marriage. The child, who lived with his mother in Seattle and had never called Elena anything more than auntie, was also paid for by her card, as steady as a heartbeat, month after month, year after year. I asked Elena that question, and she looked at me with those deep brown eyes that I had slowly learned to read over the weeks we sat together in the library. And she answered in a slow voice, as if she were rereading every word from an old book, a book she had long since memorized but had never read aloud to anyone. "Because when you love someone, you don't look at a spreadsheet," she said, and I saw the corner of her mouth curve into an almost imperceptible smile. "You look at hope. And hope doesn't have a grand total column. Hope doesn't have a cell where you enter how much you've lost, how much you've given, and when it's enough to stop. You just keep giving, because you believe that one day the numbers will balance themselves out, and the person you love will look at that spreadsheet and see what you've done, and love you more for it." She paused for a moment, turning the teacup in her hands, then added in a lower voice, as if speaking more to herself than to me, "But they don't look at the spreadsheet. They never look at the spreadsheet, because to them, what you give isn't numbers. It's just air, something they breathe every day without ever wondering where it comes from." It was a Friday evening in early October, that time of year when Portland begins to don its damp autumn coat and the drizzle is constant. The kind of rain that isn't heavy enough to make you run, but just enough to dampen your shoulders and make the streetlights blur in the rearview mirror like watercolor streaks someone accidentally smeared on the glass. Elena remembered clearly the feeling of the leather seat against her back as Derek drove his old Audi up the slick, wet hills toward downtown to a rooftop bar in an old hotel built in the 1920s. Derek's friends were celebrating the birthday of a guy named Grant, an old college buddy of his who now worked in venture capital and was the type of person who always talked about opportunities and return on investment, as if life were just a stock portfolio to be optimized. Elena wore a simple black dress that night, the kind that wasn't too expensive but fit perfectly and was never out of style. The kind of outfit she had learned to choose after 4 years of being Derek Harlow's wife. Because being Derek Harlow's wife meant you had to look beautiful enough not to embarrass him in front of his friends, but not so beautiful as to outshine the glow he radiated. It was a delicate balancing act that Elena had long since mastered without even realizing she was performing it, much like a fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water until someone pulls it onto the shore. The rooftop bar was decorated with warm, yellow string lights crisscrossing over wooden beams, small olive trees scattered among rattan tables and chairs, and a long marble bar that glowed under crystal lights. But Elena wasn't really enjoying any of it. She stood at the edge of the conversations like a silent observer, smiling at the right moments when someone looked her way, nodding when asked polite questions no one really waited for an answer to, and remaining silent for the rest of the evening. It wasn't because she had no opinions or nothing to say, but because she had learned a long time ago that in Derek's world, her role was to be a companion, not a participant. And a good companion is one who knows how to become invisible when necessary. There's a small moment that Elena would later replay in her mind many times. A moment that seemed insignificant, but would become one of the most important pieces of the picture she was slowly putting together. It was when Claire Grant's wife, a blonde woman with intelligent gray eyes and a way of speaking so direct it was almost blunt, turned to ask Elena about her work with a tone of genuine interest, not the kind of polite filler people use when they don't know what else to say. And Elena began to talk about the new inventory system she was building for a food distribution company. A system she'd spent 3 months designing that would save the company at least 15% in operating costs each year. Claire nodded, her eyes lighting up, because she also worked in supply chain management and truly understood what Elena was saying. But just as Elena started to feel seen, just as she started to think that maybe tonight wouldn't be so bad after all, Derek appeared from nowhere at her side, draping an arm over her shoulder with a possessiveness as if she were an item in his collection, and said in that half-joking, half-serious tone he always used when he wanted to belittle someone without being accused of doing it on purpose. "She does that numbers stuff. It's so boring, Claire. You should hear about our new idea. This is the real future." Elena fell silent instantly, like a lamp being switched off. Claire looked at her for a second, with an expression she couldn't quite read, pity or empathy, or perhaps both, before turning away to follow the new story Derek had enthusiastically launched into with all the confidence of a man who had never been forced to prove his own worth. Elena stood there, the smile still on her lips because she had practiced it for so long it had become leaks, but inside her, something small had just been extinguished. And she didn't even realize how often those small things were being extinguished anymore. About an hour later, when the party was in full swing and everyone was drunk enough to say things they would regret that morning, Derek left to talk privately with Grant and a few other friends in a corner of the balcony. It had a transparent glass roof that revealed the cloudy Portland night sky and the dark office buildings in the distance. Vape smoke drifted like lost souls in the yellow light, and the sound of laughter echoed from behind the half-closed glass door, the laughter of men when they are together and believe no one is listening. Elena didn't mean to eavesdrop, and I want you to believe that, because she had never been the prying or suspicious type. She simply wanted to bring Derek a glass of water, knowing he'd had at least 3 cocktails since they arrived, and that whiskey was not his stomach's friend the next morning. It was a small act of care, like countless other small acts of care she had performed over the past 4 years without a second thought. She walked toward the glass door, glass of water in hand, and that's when she heard Derek's voice. Clear, relaxed, completely unguarded, as if he were telling a joke he'd told 100 times and knew for a fact would make everyone laugh. Honestly, once she clears the last of it, I'm out. There was a short pause after that sentence, then a soft, slightly awkward chuckle, the kind of laugh people make when they aren't sure if they should be laughing. Another voice is cut in, someone Elena didn't recognize, sounding uncomfortable. "Come on, man, that's cold." Derek replied instantly, and there wasn't a hint of hesitation or regret in his voice, only the confidence of a man so used to being agreed with that he believed everything he said was the truth. Cold? No. Strategic. She's perfect for right now. Stable job, no drama. But long term? She's not my league. She's a stepping stone, bro. You don't build a house on a stepping stone. Elena stood there, behind the glass door, with the water in her hand. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She didn't drop the glass on the floor, like you see in movies when the main character hears a devastating truth. Instead, she just stood there, completely still, as if someone had just hit pause on her entire body. And the first feeling that washed over her wasn't pain, wasn't outrage, but a coldness. A chill ran down her spine from the nape of her neck to her lower back, as if someone had just thrown open a door to the middle of winter right in this warm room. And she stood there in that cold, listening to a few more sentences that she would later remember word for word on sleepless nights. "She doesn't need to know." Derek's voice rang out again, this time with an almost amused tone, as if he was savoring the cleverness of his own plan. "She's happy. Let her be happy. She thinks we're building an empire together. Cute, right?" More laughter, this time more natural, more at ease, as if the initial awkwardness had faded and the men had decided this was just a harmless joke between friends. Elena stood there and listened to that laughter echo through the glass door, and she realized that they were used to this kind of talk. This wasn't the first time Derek had said things like this, and it wouldn't be the last, because not one of them had ever stood up and said, "Stop." Not one of them had ever said, "What you're saying is wrong." Not one of them had ever considered her important enough to defend, even when she wasn't there. But it was the second feeling that changed everything. Because after the cold came awareness. An awareness so sharp and astonishingly clear, it was as if for the past 4 years she had been looking at the world through a frosted glass pane she never knew was there. And someone had just wiped it clean with one decisive swipe. And everything became cruelly sharp. Every little detail she had ignored, every word she had justified, every action she had forgiven, all appeared before her like the final pieces of a puzzle falling into place. And the complete picture wasn't a marriage, but a meticulously planned scam, and she was the only victim who didn't know she was being conned. She remembered every time Derek had said, "Let me handle it," in that reassuring voice she now understood was the voice of someone who didn't want her to ask any more questions. She remembered every time he complained that she didn't understand his ambition, whenever she tried to ask about financial plans or specific deadlines. She remembered every time he introduced her to friends or partners with a slightly condescending tone, as if she were a detail that needed explaining, an asterisk at the bottom of the page that required the footnote. "She's an accountant, not really relevant to what we're discussing." And all those fragmented memories strung themselves together into a rope she had unknowingly used to bind herself for the past 4 years. Elena didn't walk onto the balcony to confront Derek. She didn't throw open the glass door and hurl the water in his face in front of all his friends, like a climactic scene in a movie that would earn applause from the audience. Because real life isn't a movie, and Elena wasn't the type to burn everything down just for a brief moment of satisfaction. She just turned around slowly, placed the glass of water on a small nearby table, smoothed the folds of her black dress out of unconscious habit, and returned to the party with the smile still intact on her lips. The smile she had worn for 4 years that now suddenly felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. And no one at the party that night noticed anything unusual. No one saw the woman who had just walked away from the balcony in silence and sat back down in her chair as if nothing had happened. Because when you've spent years becoming invisible in your own life, disappearing becomes an instinct. And that night Elena disappeared right before their very eyes, and not a single person noticed. On the way home, Derek sat in the passenger seat and rambled on about an investment opportunity. Grant had just mentioned a new fund Grant was building that Derek believed he could convince him to let him join as a strategic advisor. He spoke about it with all the excitement of a person who had never known failure, while Elena sat behind the steering wheel and was silent for a full 20 minutes. And Derek didn't notice the silence, because he had never really listened to her. Not even when she spoke, not even when she laughed, not even when she cried quietly in the bathroom on nights she thought everything was falling apart. He had never truly listened, and tonight was no exception. When they walked into the apartment, Derek sprawled onto the sofa that Elena had bought with her own credit card 2 years ago during a summer sale. turned on the TV for which Elena paid the cable bill every month, and said in a voice that was tired yet full of the expectation that others would serve him, "Can you get me a glass of water?" Elena stood in the kitchen doorway, and she looked at him, truly looked. Perhaps, for the first time in 4 years, she truly saw the person lying on that sofa without any filter. She saw a man who had spent 4 years building his future on her shoulders while constantly talking about class and stature, as if those things were innate, not sponsored by every single dollar earned by the woman standing in the kitchen. And in that moment she felt no hatred, no pain, only a strange emptiness, as if a room had been cleared of all its furniture, leaving only the echo of what used to be there. She poured the water, brought it to him, and said in a voice so calm it surprised even herself, "You're tired. You should get some sleep." That night, after Derek had fallen into a deep sleep, breathing evenly, with the relaxed face of a man with no regrets, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table. She turned on the small desk lamp she'd bought at a thrift store on Hawthorne Street and opened her laptop, not to cry, not to write in a journal or confide in someone on social media, but to do the one thing she did best, the thing she had been trained and conditioned to do her entire adult life. She opened a new Excel spreadsheet, named the file Truth, and began to type the first numbers. I asked Elena later, after we had become friends, and she trusted me enough to answer the hard questions. I asked her if in that moment, the moment she stood behind the glass door with a cup of water in her hand and heard those words from the mouth of the man she had loved and sacrificed for 4 years, if she had wanted to scream, if she had wanted to walk out onto the balcony and throw that glass of water right in his face in front of all his friends, if she had wanted to do something big and dramatic to let him know she had heard everything and that she would never forgive those words. She shook her head, and then she told me in a very soft but very steady voice, a voice I had learned was the one she used when she was speaking a truth that had been honed over many sleepless nights. When you discover that you are merely a tool in someone else's plan, you don't scream, you don't cry. Those things don't help because tears don't change the facts. Tears only blur the numbers that you need to see clearly. And in that moment, the only thing that can change your position in that truth isn't emotion, but action. And the first action is always to sit down, open a spreadsheet, and start counting. The next morning, Elena woke up early as always, made coffee for Derek, the Colombian kind he liked, and placed the mug on the table next to the TV remote, just as she had for the past 4 years. And when Derek walked out of the bedroom, his hair a mess, and letting out his usual long yawn, she smiled at him. It was a smile that no one in the world could have recognized had changed, because it looked exactly like yesterday's smile, and last week's, and last year's. But inside, it was hollow, like a chrysalis left behind long after the butterfly has flown away, and Derek didn't notice. Of course, he didn't notice, because he had never looked at Elena long enough to see what lay beneath the surface of that smile. She asked him how his day was looking, if he had any meetings, if he needed her to prepare anything. And Derek replied with the familiar lines she had heard hundreds of times, "Pretty busy. Got a few interesting things going on. I'll handle it." And Elena nodded just as she always did. But this time, the nod wasn't one of agreement. It was a period, the end of a chapter she hadn't even had time to name. And the moment the door closed behind Derek, the moment the sound of his footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden stairs and then faded completely on the floor below, Elena sat down at the kitchen table, opened her computer, and began to do what she had been trained to do for 6 years as an accountant. What she did better than anyone else in her office. She began to take inventory. The Excel file opened with a name she typed without hesitation, Truth, and inside, she created columns, arranged as neatly and precisely as she would for any financial report. Date, expense, amount, payer, notes. The headings were dry and emotionless, like the nature of the numbers themselves. But what she was about to fill them with was anything but dry, because this was not a financial report for some anonymous food distribution company. This was the financial report of her own life for the past 4 years, and every number she typed would be a gold, surgical scalpel, cutting open the tumor she had been carrying inside her for 4 years without knowing it existed. She started with the most obvious things, the ones lying right on the surface like old scars you don't have to dig deep to find. Her credit card statements for the past 24 months were downloaded from the bank's website site as PDF files, and she sat there for hours, tracing every transaction, every line, every number. The $130 charge for the shirt Derek wore to the meeting with Grant back in March. The $215 for the dinner at the restaurant that Derek said was necessary for the partner relationship, but that partner never appeared in any contract. The $50 a week for gas for the car Derek used to drive all over the city to meet people he called potential investors. The $3,000 she had transferred to Derek last November for him to invest in an opportunity that can't be missed, and she had never seen a report on that investment, never seen a single dollar of profit, never heard it mentioned again beyond the phrase, "It's in progress," that Derek would say whenever she happened to ask. Then came the deeper things, the things she had hidden even from herself because looking directly at them would force her to admit something she wasn't ready to face. The money she sent to Derek's mother every 3 months, $500 each time, totaling $6,000 over 3 years, because Mrs. Harlow was having a hard time and Derek couldn't let his mom go without, and Elena never refused, never asked why a woman living in a luxury apartment retirement fund would need extra money every quarter, because to ask would be disrespectful. To ask would be show mistrust. To ask would make her a bad daughter-in-law in the eyes of a woman who had never truly seen her as family. And then there was the $400 a month for the school of Derek's own son, the child who lived with his mother in Seattle, and called Elena Auntie in that flat, indifferent tone that only children caught between divorces have. $400 a month multiplied by 48 months was $19,200. And Elena paused at that number for a long time, not because she regretted the money sent, but because she realized that in all those 4 years, Derek had never once said thank you for it. Never once had he held her and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Never once had he acknowledged that her paying for his son's tuition was not her obligation, but a gift, an enormous gift that he accepted as if it were his due, like the air he breathed, as if it was always there and always would be, without any cost. The numbers began to line up before her eyes, not screaming, not shouting, just quietly forming columns and rows like soldiers in an army she never knew she was commanding. And the more she looked at them, the more she saw clearly something she had never dared to think before. This wasn't support. This wasn't sharing. This was funding. A massive, silent investment she had been pouring into one man's dream. And that man was not only ungrateful, but was planning to leave her the moment that funding was no longer necessary. On the afternoon of the second day, as Elena sat at her desk in her office in Tigard, trying to focus on the third quarter report in front of her, her phone buzzed with an unknown number from the downtown Portland area. She almost declined the call, not in the mood for telemarketers or wrong numbers, but some instinct made her answer. On the other end was the voice of Claire, the blonde woman with the intelligent gray eyes she had met at the dinner party on Friday. And Claire's voice sounded hesitant, a stark contrast to the confidence she had projected that night. "Elena, I don't know if I should be calling, and I hope you don't find me forward or invasive, but I've been thinking a lot about Friday night, and I think you should know something," Claire said, her voice slower than usual, as if she were weighing each word before speaking. And then she told Elena that after they left, her husband, Grant, had come home in a strange mood. Not cheerful like he usually was after meeting up with friends, but annoyed, restless, like there was a pebble in his shoe he couldn't get out. Grant told me that Derek has been saying similar things for months, about how he'll leave you as soon as all the debts are paid off. And Grant said it with annoyance, not approval. He said, "Derek's been running his mouth for months about how he'll dump her once she's dried up. It's getting embarrassing. And I think you need to know that. I don't know you. I've only met you once, but I saw the way you looked at Derek that night after he cut off your story. And I think you're an intelligent woman, and intelligent women deserve to know the truth about their own lives." Elena thanked Claire in a voice so calm that she herself was surprised to hear it coming from her own mouth. A voice that didn't tremble, didn't break, didn't carry any sign of someone who had just received one of the cruelest blows a person can receive. And after hanging up, she sat still in her office for a full 15 minutes, staring at the computer screen where the third quarter report was still open and unfinished. And then she opened the Truth Excel file she had saved on her machine, scrolled down to the last line of the spreadsheet, and added a new entry in the notes column. Confirmation from a third party. No longer any doubt. On the third day, Elena began to observe Derek in a way she never had before. Not with the eyes of a wife looking at her husband with love and hope, and all the rose-colored filters that love tends to place before one's eyes, but with the eyes of a researcher observing her subject. Cold, meticulous, emotionless, with only notation and analysis. And the most terrifying thing wasn't what she discovered, but the fact that all of it had been right there in front of her for the past 4 years. She had simply chosen not to see it. She noticed how Derek said "we" when he needed money and "I" when he discussed the future. 2 words that seemed meaningless, but were, in fact, the key that unlocked the entire nature of their relationship. It was, "We need to pay this off. We're in a bit of trouble. We'll get through this." But when it came to the future, it was always, "I will succeed. I will make a name for myself. I will show them all." She never appeared in those sentences about the future. She only appeared in the sentences about expenses, like a wallet, like a cushion, like a soulless tool that one only mentions when it's needed. She noticed how Derek never asked about her work unless the question could lead to an answer involving money. "How was your day?" Was a question he never asked, but "Has your salary come in this month?" was always asked on the 28th of every month with an astonishing precision that only someone who truly cares about something can possess. And Elena realized that the thing Derek truly cared about wasn't her, but the 28th, the number in her bank account, the steady stream of cash that flowed into his life each month without him having to do a single thing to earn it. She noticed the way Derek's friends looked at her, and this was perhaps the most painful part, because it didn't come from Derek. It came from the outsiders, the ones who had seen the truth long ago but never spoke up. Some looked at her with pity, as if she were a wounded animal trying to stand. Some looked at her with contempt, as if she deserved what was happening for not being smart enough to realize it. And some, like Marcus, like Claire, looked at her with shame. Shame on Derek's behalf. Shame for having been silent for so long. Shame for being part of a system that allowed things like this to happen. And she noticed the way Derek talked about class, never directly, never openly, but it was always there, in every story, every comment, every judgment of others. About who was high caliber and who was mediocre, about who was worth noticing and who could be ignored, about those born to lead and those who should only support. And she understood that for the past 4 years, Derek had been constantly telling her her place in that system. She just hadn't heard it, or had chosen not to hear it, because to hear it meant she would have to act. And acting was so much more terrifying than continuing to stay silent and hope. The 4th day was a day of memories. The fragmented pieces of the past began to rise up like hastily buried corpses, the earth above them washed away by a flood, and Elena could no longer stop them. Every word, Every moment, every time she had laughed when she should have cried, every time she had been silent when she should have screamed. It all came back with the ruthless clarity that only the truth can bring. "You're lucky to have me, you know. Who else would put up with a boring accountant like you?" Derek had said that on a winter evening as they were eating pizza in the living room. And he laughed when he said it, and she had laughed along, because it was just a joke, a harmless joke between a husband and wife. But now, remembering it, she could hear the truth hidden inside that joke. The truth that Derek really did think she was boring, really did think she didn't deserve him, really did think he was doing her a favor by being with her. And she had laughed. She had agreed to it with her laughter. "When I'm rich, I'll buy you a beautiful house, a little far away since you like the quiet." Derek had said that as they were driving through the Lake Oswego suburbs, past luxurious wooden houses hidden behind towering pine trees. And at the time, she thought it was a sign of his care, a promise of a future, proof that he wanted to take care of her. But now she understood. A little far away meant out of sight. That meant easy to forget. And easy to forget meant convenient for other plans she wasn't allowed to know about. And she had nodded. She had thanked him. She had placed her hand on his and said, "I really unlike the quiet," as if she were signing her own sentence. Each memory was a brick, and Elena sat there in the quiet apartment on a Thursday afternoon while Derek was out somewhere meeting partners, and she laid each brick one by one, building a wall. Not a wall to imprison anyone, not a wall to separate, but a wall to protect, because she knew the days to come would be very difficult, and she needed something solid to lean on when the storm hit. On the 5th day, Elena cried, and this was the only time in this entire story that she allowed herself to do so. Not for Derek, not for what he had said or done or planned, but for herself. For the woman who had spent 4 years believing she was building a home when she was actually building a launch pad for someone else. For the woman who had traded her youth and her energy and her salary for a future that never existed. For the woman in the mirror she saw every morning, but whose eyes she never truly looked into, until today. She cried in the bathroom with the water turned on full blast to drown out the sobs. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks and mixed with the cold water from the shower, and she gave herself 15 minutes, no more. 15 minutes to mourn what was lost, the trust that was betrayed, the love that was used, the 4 years of her life that she would never get back. And when those 15 minutes were over, she turned off the water, dried her face with the white cotton towel hanging on the rack, looked straight into her own eyes in the mirror, and said aloud just one single word, "Enough." Elena told me later, after we had become friends and our afternoons at the coffee shop on Flanders Street had become a ritual, that moment wasn't her weakest, even though it was filled with tears, even though it held all the pain she had suppressed for 4 years. It was, in fact, her strongest moment, because she had allowed herself to feel pain, allowed herself to admit that what had happened was wrong, allowed herself to let go of the hope that things would go back to the way they were. And after she had hurt, after she had hit the bottom of that pain and stood up from it, she no longer owed anyone another tear. Not Derek, not his mother, not the friends who had stayed silent, not the whole world that had looked at her with pity. Because tears are the currency of those who still have hope, and she had spent her very last coin on that Thursday afternoon. On Monday morning, Elena put on the charcoal gray business suit she always wore for meetings with the CFO, a suit that wasn't too flashy, but was enough to make her feel professional and protected, as if the fabric were a thin layer of armor against the outside world. And during her lunch break, instead of going to her usual Mexican place, she drove to the bank branch on Hawthorne Street, walking through the glass doors with all the calm of someone buying a loaf of bread, not someone taking the first step in a silent revolution. The bank teller who assisted her was a young woman named Rachel, her nameplate written in a clean sans serif font. She had black-framed glasses, her hair tied up neatly, and a professional smile trained to never judge a client, no matter how strange their story might be. And when Elena said the words, "I'd like to open a new personal account," in a monotone voice, as if she were asking for a reprint of last month's statement, Rachel simply nodded and typed a few lines on her computer. She asked the routine questions while maintaining an air of absolute respect. "You already have a joint account with us, is that correct?" And Elena replied, "Yes, but I need a separate one, for my salary, starting next month," with that same sense of calm, as if she were discussing the weather outside or the grocery list for the coming week. Rachel didn't ask anything else. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't glance at a colleague, didn't betray any sign of curiosity. And perhaps that was because she'd been doing this job long enough to have met many women like Elena. Women who sat before her with steady voices and hands that didn't tremble, but whose eyes held an entire story they weren't yet ready to tell anyone. Stories of joint accounts that had become financial prisons, of salaries drained each month for someone else's dreams, of women who woke up one morning and decided that enough was enough. And Rachel had learned that her job wasn't to ask why, but simply to print out the papers, request a signature in the right place, and smile, and wish them a good day as they walked out with a new account and a new future in their handbag. 3 days later, Elena arrived at a law office in Northeast Portland, an old red brick building tucked between a Jewish bakery and a used bookstore. She had found it online after 2 hours of searching with keywords like Portland family lawyer, financial divorce consultation, and protecting personal assets. She chose this office not because it had the highest ratings or the most comments, but because a line in the website's introduction made her stop and read it 3 times over. "We believe the law is not a weapon for revenge, but a tool to reestablish justice." Elena thought that was exactly what she was looking for. Not a lawyer who would help her grind Derek into dust, but one who would help her stand up and walk away from the ruins with all her dignity intact. The lawyer, Miriam Okonkwo, was a Nigerian woman in her 50s, with a deep, warm voice and a way of looking directly into your eyes that made you feel she had already seen your entire story before you even opened your mouth. On her desk was a photo of 3 women in graduation gowns, her and her 2 daughters, all 3 of them smiling radiantly under the sun of some long-ago summer day. Elena looked at that picture and thought that this was exactly the kind of woman she wanted on her side in the coming fight, a woman who had raised 2 successful daughters in a foreign land, a woman who understood what it was to fight and what it was to win. Elena placed the folder on the table. The entire Truth Excel file had been printed and neatly arranged in a navy blue binder, its columns of numbers standing straight like rows of soldiers awaiting the order to charge. Miriam flipped through each page with the focused expression of a doctor reading an X-ray, remaining silent for nearly 5 minutes before looking up and asking in her characteristically deep, warm voice, "How long has it been?" 4 years of marriage, Elena replied, then paused a beat before adding in a smaller, yet unwavering voice. "But I think the truth is, it's been from the beginning. From the very first day. It's just that I didn't know, or didn't want to know, or both." Miriam nodded, and that nod held neither judgment nor pity. It was simply an acknowledgement, a recognition that what Elena had just said was the truth, and that now they would deal with it together. She began to explain to Elena what she needed to know about Oregon's community property and separate property laws, about debt obligations and financial responsibilities in a marriage, and most importantly, about a legal fact Elena had never known. She had no legal obligation to pay the personal debts Derek had accumulated before and during the marriage if those debts did not bear her consenting signature. This meant that everything she had paid for the past 4 years, all $12,000 in credit card debt, $8,000 in personal loans, the car payments, the tuition, the allowance for his mother, all of it had been gifts. Enormous gifts that she had given voluntarily, and now she had every right to stop giving them. "I don't want revenge," Elena said, and it was the first time during the meeting that her voice held a trace of emotion. Not sadness, not anger, but something like a plea to be understood. "I don't want to hurt him. I don't want to destroy him. I just want it to stop. I just want to stop carrying things on my shoulders that don't belong to me. Is that okay?" Miriam looked at Elena over the rim of her glasses, and for a moment her gaze softened, as if she had just realized something about the young woman sitting before her. And she said something that Elena would remember for all the years to come, a sentence she would recount to me with a slow voice and slightly misty eyes whenever she spoke of it. "Stopping isn't revenge, Miss Vasquez. Stopping is returning responsibility to the person it belongs to. He has lived off your silence for 4 years, but silence is not an obligation. Silence is a gift, and you have the right to stop giving it whenever you want." Elena left Miriam's office that afternoon with a folder much thicker than the one she had arrived with. Inside was an action plan, clearly numbered in a style that reflected her own way of working. Step 1. Transfer her entire salary to a new personal account, starting with the next pay cycle. This had actually been done right after she left the bank on Monday, with an email to the HR department titled "Update Payroll Account Information," and a brief message of only 3 lines. Step 2. Send a formal notice to Derek regarding the 50-50 split of living expenses, effective next month. This notice would be sent via email and printed out as a hard copy signed by both parties, following the exact legal procedure Miriam had outlined. Step 3. Cease all automatic payments for Derek's personal debts, including the credit card, the personal loan, and the Audi car payments. These were payments she had set up on autopay from her account so long ago that she had forgotten she could stop them at any time. Step 4. Contact the landlord to inform them of a potential change to the lease agreement in the event that things came to an end and one of them had to move out. And Step 5. Prepare all necessary legal documents for the division of assets and debts, in case Derek's reaction was to take the matter to court. Each step had a specific timeline marked on a calendar in different colored squares: green for completed tasks, yellow for tasks in progress, and red for tasks requiring Miriam's assistance. Elena looked at that calendar with a strange feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't joy, it wasn't satisfaction, nor was it sadness or regret. It was like the feeling of someone who has just walked out of a dark room and is waiting for their eyes to adjust to the light. A strange and slightly blinding sensation, but also full of hope. That night, after Derek had fallen fast asleep, following a tiring day of meeting with partners that she no longer asked about in detail, Elena sat down at the kitchen table with her familiar little desk lamp and a new notebook she had bought on her way home. It was a dark brown leather-bound journal with crisp, blank pages untouched by any ink, and she began to write. Not a plan, not Usrajpeet, not a to-do list, but a letter. The first letter she had written to herself after 4 years of writing, only checks and bills and notes in an Excel file for someone else's expenses. Elena, you believed that love was about staying. Staying when odds were hard, staying when people needed you, staying when you were tired and lonely and had no idea where any of this was going. And that's not wrong. Staying is a beautiful thing. Staying is a gift, but you confused staying with disappearing. You stayed for so long that you forgot you also had the right to be seen, to be heard, to be considered a person and not a tool. And now you see the truth. The truth that love isn't a trial where you have to defend yourself every day. Love isn't an investment where only one party puts in the capital. Staying isn't love if the other person has been planning to leave all along. And you don't have to prove your worth to anyone. Worth doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be realized. And you're starting to realize it. You're starting to see it in the mirror every morning, and one day you won't have to remind yourself of it anymore. Because it will have become a part of you. Like breathing, like your heartbeat, like the blood flowing in your veins. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her desk drawer. Not to hide it, not out of shame, but so that later, when all of this was over, she could open it and read it again and remember that she had been at the lowest point of her life and she had stood up on her own 2 feet. Without anyone pulling her, without anyone propping her up, without anyone to confirm that she deserved to stand. The moment Derek began to realize something was wrong came on Thursday evening as they were eating a late dinner in front of the TV, just like any other day. Derek's phone rang, showing an unknown number with a 503 area code. He answered with the annoyed look of someone being disturbed during their downtime, but within seconds, that look shifted from annoyance to confusion, and then to anger. He hung up so abruptly that Elena heard the shrill beep from the phone's speaker. His face flushed red in the blue glow of the TV screen, and when he turned to her, his voice had lost its usual confidence, replaced by an almost childlike bewilderment. Someone called demanding money. A debt-collection agency or something. I don't understand. You paid that already, didn't you? It's supposed to be paid on the 15th of every month. Why are they still calling? Elena was at the sink washing dishes, her back to Derek. She didn't turn around right away. She let his question hang in the air for a moment, like a deflating balloon slowly sinking to the ground. Then she wiped her hands on the kitchen towel hanging on a hook, turned around very slowly, and said in the calmest voice she could muster at that moment, "I haven't paid it, and I'm not going to pay it anymore. That's your personal loan from before we were married." Silence. A silence so thick Elena could hear the ticking of the kitchen wall clock, second by second. And then Derek laughed. It wasn't a comfortable laugh at all. It was the kind of laugh people make when they aren't sure if the other person is joking or being serious, and they're hoping it's a joke. "You're kidding, right? You're joking with me, right?" Elena wiped the last drops of water from her hands, folded the kitchen towel neatly, and placed it on the countertop. Then she looked directly into Derek's eyes, her deep brown eyes meeting his wide, bewildered blue ones. And she spoke in a voice that wasn't loud, but was so clear it was as if she were delivering a sentence that had been prepared long ago. "I've never been more serious in the past 4 years, Derek." It was the first time in 4 years that Derek looked at Elena and didn't see a woman smiling at him, didn't see a wife nodding and saying, "I'll take care of it," whenever he ran into trouble, didn't see a familiar figure always standing behind him, ready to catch anything he dropped. Instead, he saw a woman who had stopped smiling, a woman standing straight and looking at him with the eyes of someone who no longer owed him anything. And that difference, that disappearance of her familiar smile, was more terrifying than any scream, more threatening than any threat, because it signaled something Derek was never prepared to face. The woman he saw as his launch pad, his stepping stone, his temporary tool on the path to success, was no longer there, and she had left without even bothering to say goodbye. In the first few days after Elena announced she would no longer be paying his personal loan, Derek chose not to believe what he'd just heard. Because belief is a strange thing. It can linger long after all the evidence has pointed to the contrary, much like a sunken ship still leaves bubbles rising to the surface, long after its hull has settled at the bottom of the sea. And Derek clung to those bubbles with all the desperation of a man who had never had to face the consequences of his actions. He told himself that Elena was just sulking, that she was just overreacting to something trivial, that women were emotional by nature, and all it would take was a little time and a little sweetness for everything to go back to normal. And with that belief, he began to deploy the same old tactic he had used dozens of times before whenever Elena showed any sign of displeasure. The tactic he believed had never failed and would never fail because he believed he understood Elena, believed she was just like all the other women he had ever known, women who could be won over with flowers and wine and sweet whispers in the evening. He bought flowers, not the cheap kind from the supermarket checkout, but a bouquet of deep red roses wrapped in white tissue paper from the upscale florist on Pearl Street. He placed it on the kitchen table on a Friday afternoon with a small bearing the words, "I love you," in his hurried handwriting. When Elena came home and saw the bouquet, she smiled and said, "Thank you," in a polite tone, as if she were thanking a colleague for holding a door open for her. Then she set the bouquet on the table, not in the center where it would be seen by anyone entering the kitchen, but in a hidden corner near the window, and as if it were just an item, an inanimate object carrying no message at all. The next day, she put it in an old vase in the corner of the living room and never mentioned it again. He cooked dinner, something he hadn't done in 4 years, except for the times he wanted to prove a point. He made seafood pasta with a garlic cream sauce, a recipe he'd spent 2 hours watching on YouTube that afternoon. He set the table with a white tablecloth, scented candles, and a bottle of red wine he'd bought using a cash advance from his credit card. When Elena sat down at the table and saw it all, she smiled again, that same polite smile, and said, "Thank you, this looks delicious." And she ate, and she complimented the pasta, and she took a sip of wine, and all of it was done with such perfect neutrality that Derek felt as if he were having dinner with a stranger who had been taught how to be polite but had no intention of becoming his friend. He tried to touch her, a hand held as they sat on the sofa watching TV, a hug from behind as she stood washing dishes in the kitchen. Intimate gestures that used to make her relax and lean into him like a cat being petted. But now, her body was no longer soft. It didn't recoil, it didn't resist, but it didn't respond either. It was simply there, as neutral and cold as a marble statue in a museum, as if she had withdrawn all her warmth into some deep place inside her that he could no longer reach. And for the first time in his life, Derek realized that there are some distances that cannot be bridged by flowers and wine, and apologies spoken only because one wants things to go back to the way they were. When sweetness didn't work, Derek moved on to the next tactic without hesitation, because that's how his brain operated. If plan A doesn't work, move to plan B, as if relationships were just a business problem to be solved with the right strategies and tactics. And the next tactic in his arsenal was to attack, because attacking is always the best defense. He had learned that long ago, from the times he was caught lying about his grades in college, from the times partners questioned him about work progress, from the times creditors called, and he had to yell so they wouldn't dare ask another question. What are you doing? Are you going to destroy this marriage over a joke? Do you have any idea how many people would kill to have what you have? Do you know how much pressure I've been under to build a career for us? Derek said, his voice rising with each sentence like an orchestra building to a crescendo. He slammed his hand on the kitchen table with enough force to make Elena's cup rattle and emit a small clinking sound, but Elena didn't flinch. She didn't cower like she used to whenever Derek raised his voice. Instead, she just stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her brown eyes looking straight at Derek with a calmness that only fueled his anger, because nothing infuriates a man trying to dominate someone more than their refusal to be dominated. And Elena said, in a slow voice, as if explaining a simple concept to a child, "A joke is something that makes both people laugh, Derek. What you said that night didn't include me in its laughter, and a joke that only one person finds funny isn't a joke, it's a confession. You don't understand my pressure. You don't understand how hard it is to build a career. You sit in your office with your safe little numbers and you think you know everything, but you know nothing. You don't know how the world out there works. You don't know what people have to trade to get a seat at the table," Derek continued, his tone now shifting from anger to something resembling resentment, as if he truly believed he was the victim in this story. Elena looked at him, and for a moment she almost laughed. Not because what he said was funny, but because the irony of the situation was so immense it was almost absurd. And she said, her voice not trembling in the slightest. "I have paid every single bill in this house for 3 years. I paid for the car you drive. I paid for the dinners you call client meetings. I paid for your son's tuition. I've paid for your mother's medication every quarter. I think I understand pressure very well. I just don't understand why you assumed all of that was a given." A few days later, after his anger had cooled and Derek realized the attack tactic had also yielded no results, he moved to the next phase in the familiar cycle of the desperate, the bargaining phase. He sat down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the expression of a man who had done a lot of thinking and was prepared to make great concessions. And he said, in the most sincere voice he could muster after years of practice, "I'll change, I promise. I know I was wrong. I said terrible things, but they were just words. You can't destroy everything over a few things said while I was drunk. We can pay off the debt together, then start over. No more secrets. I'll be transparent with you about everything." Elena shook her head, and it wasn't a refusal made in the heat of the moment. It was a refusal that had been thoroughly considered, weighed during long, sleepless nights, and reinforced by every number in the Excel file and every line in the dark brown, leather-bound notebook. She said slowly, as if explaining an obvious truth that Derek should have realized long ago. "The problem isn't the debt, Derek. The problem is how you see me. You see me as a means, as a tool, as something useful but temporary. And I can't be with someone who sees me as a tool. I am not a tool. I am a person." "I never said that. I never called you a tool," Derek protested, and in his voice there was a genuine bewilderment, as if he truly didn't understand what he had done wrong. As if, to him, the act of planning to leave his wife the moment she finished paying off his debts was just a passing thought, a normal thing that anyone would do, and he truly couldn't understand why it had become such a big deal. "You don't have to say it," Elena replied, and her voice now had a trace of weariness. Not weariness from this argument, but the weariness of having to explain things that should never have needed explaining. "You planned it. You told your friends about it. You laughed about it. Your plan involved me disappearing after everything was paid off, didn't it? Just answer one thing. Didn't it?" Silence. And in that silence, Derek didn't deny it, because he couldn't deny it, because he knew Elena had heard everything. The only thing he could do was whisper, in a voice much smaller than that of the man who had once stood on the balcony and declared to his friends that his wife was just a stepping stone. "You were eavesdropping on me. You spoke loud enough for the whole balcony to hear," Elena answered, and her voice was no longer tired, only filled with a truth that had been honed into a cold, sharp blade. "That wasn't eavesdropping, Derek. That was the truth finding its way to me. Because truth is like water. It always finds a way to leak through the cracks. And you left far too many cracks." In the days that followed, Derek turned to his friends, the ones who had laughed at the party that day, who had clapped him on the back and said, "That's classic Derek," with admiration when he called his wife temporary. He called Grant first, because Grant was the wealthiest among them, the one he believed would always be ready to help an old friend in a time of need. But Grant was busy. Grant's secretary said he was in an important meeting and would call back later. Grant never called back, and Derek understood that someone like Grant was never truly busy. He just didn't want to get involved. He called the others, the names he had once mentioned to Elena as his closest friends, the ones who would always have each other's backs. But one didn't pick up. Another answered and said they were having some financial trouble and couldn't help right now, and another was more blunt, saying they didn't want to get mixed up in this. Derek began to realize something he had never considered before. Friendships built on laughter and rooftop cocktails weren't real friendships. They were just an unspoken agreement between people enjoying the good times together. And when the good times ended, so did the agreement. Marcus was the only one who picked up and spoke honestly. His voice was no longer awkward like it had been at the party. It had shifted to something like shame. Shame for having been silent for so long. Shame for having been part of the system that allowed things like this to happen. Derek, you've been talking behind your wife's back for 2 years. I've heard you say those things at least 5 or 6 times, and I never said anything. I never told you to stop, and I'm sorry for that. But I can't help you now. I'm not comfortable with it. I think you need to handle this on your own. Derek hung up and sat there in the dark living room. The TV had been off for hours. The lights were off too. There was only the faint glow from the street light outside, filtering through the window that overlooked the old maple tree. For the first time in his life, he felt the world he had painstakingly built shrinking. The people who had once surrounded him, the laughter that had once echoed every time he said something clever or funny. It was all dissolving like vape smoke in the Portland night wind. And all that was left was an empty apartment and a woman who had once loved him but now sat in the kitchen, reading a book, and no longer looked up when he entered the room. He got up and walked to the kitchen, where Elena was sitting at the wooden table with a book open in front of her and a cup of sugar-free black tea steaming gently beside it. He stood there in the doorway, like a child lost in his own home, awkward and unsure of where to begin. Finally, he spoke in a voice smaller than any Elena had ever heard from him in their 4 years together. "I don't know what to do." Elena looked up from her book, and she saw him. Truly saw him, not with the eyes of a betrayed wife, not with the eyes of an angry woman, but with the eyes of someone who had accepted the truth, passed through the pain, and reached the other side. She said, in a voice that was very soft but very clear, "I know you don't know what to do, but that's not my problem anymore. It's your problem. And I think it's time you started solving your own problems." The day Derek moved out was a drizzly Saturday morning. The kind of quintessential Portland rain that Elena was so used to, she no longer heard it pattering on the awning. Tiny droplets slanted in the wind and clung to the window panes like shattered glass. Derek had arranged to stay with an old friend in Vancouver, Washington, just across the interstate bridge, far enough that they wouldn't accidentally run into each other at the grocery store or their usual coffee shop, and close enough for the divorce proceedings to be handled in the same county. He carried 2 suitcases, a black one with frayed corners and a gray one Elena had bought for him on a trip to Seattle 3 years ago. He placed them by the front door with an unusual carefulness, as if afraid of scratching the hardwood floors Elena had polished. There was no drama, no fighting, no reproaches or tears or accusations thrown back and forth like knives. It was just a quiet end, like the way the maple leaves outside the window fell without a sound. And Elena thought that perhaps this was how most marriages ended, not with a big bang, but with a sigh, not with a slammed door, but with a door closing very gently. At the threshold, Derek stopped. Elena saw his hand grip the suitcase handle, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright in that moment. And when he turned to look at her, his blue eyes no longer held the charming confidence she had once loved and had also come to hate. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, the emptiness of a person who has just realized that everything he believed in was an illusion. He said, in a voice Elena had never heard from him before, a voice stripped of all defense, "I was wrong, not about the money. I can earn money back, but about you. I thought you were weak because you were silent. I thought silence was a sign of endurance, of submission. But I didn't understand your silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. A patience I never deserved to receive. And when your patience ran out." He didn't finish the sentence, but Elena didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew what it was. She had lived with it for the past 4 years. She had seen it in the mirror every morning when she asked herself how much longer she could endure. And now, she no longer had to ask that question, because the answer was as clear as the numbers on her Excel spreadsheet. Her patience had run out, and the world kept turning. The sun still rose every morning, and she was still alive. "Goodbye, Derek," she said, and that was all that needed to be said, because sometimes the simplest words hold the most meaning. The door closed behind him with the soft click of the lock. No slam, no noise, just a door closing like any other in a lifetime. Elena stood there in the empty apartment, the gray light of the rainy morning filtering through the window. She listened to the sound of Derek's footsteps on the creaky wooden stairs one last time. And when the sound faded away downstairs, she let out a long breath she didn't know she had been holding for so long. In the days that followed, Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't throw a divorce party with friends like you see in romantic comedies. She didn't post anything on social media, no cryptic statuses about freedom and new beginnings. She simply continued to live. She went to work each morning, came home each afternoon, cooked for one instead of two, and realized cooking for one wasn't as bad as she'd once thought. She did yoga on Saturday mornings at the community studio on Division Street, read books on Sunday evenings under the warm yellow glow of a small desk lamp she'd bought at a thrift store. And slowly, she learned to enjoy the quiet she had always feared. There were evenings when she sat alone in the living room and felt a strange emptiness seeping into every corner of the apartment. But she quickly realized this wasn't the emptiness of loss, not the space Derek left behind when he walked away. It was the emptiness of freedom, a vast space she'd never had the chance to explore because for 4 years she had spent all the empty space in her life filling the voids of someone else. And now, for the first time, she could stand in the middle of her apartment and spread her arms wide without touching anyone. And it wasn't as scary as she'd imagined. In fact, it felt like relief, a deep, bone-marrow relief she had never allowed herself to feel before. On a Wednesday evening, about 2 months after Derek moved out, Elena happened to walk past the Multnomah County Library on her way home and saw a small poster tacked to the community notice board. Volunteers needed to teach basic accounting to immigrant women. She stood there before that poster for nearly 5 minutes, with a strange feeling she couldn't quite name, the feeling of someone who has just found something they didn't even know they were looking for. The following week, she began teaching a small class of 7 women from 7 different countries, all of whom carried the dream of opening a small business in this foreign land. She taught them the very basics of bookkeeping, how to distinguish between expenses and profit, how to read a balance sheet, and how to create a financial plan for a new business. And she didn't receive a single dollar for those Wednesday evenings, but what she received in return was more precious than any amount of money. It was the grateful look in those women's eyes when they finally understood a concept they had previously thought was too complex. It was the tight hugs at the end of each class. It was the feeling that she was doing something meaningful, something that had nothing to do with Derek or any other man, something that was completely and entirely her own. And it was during those Wednesday evenings, standing before these women who were trying to build a new life from scratch, that Elena realized something it had taken her 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars to learn. Her worth wasn't defined by whether someone needed her. Her worth wasn't defined by whether Derek acknowledged her. Her worth lay in what she could do, what she could give freely without needing anyone to repay her. And that worth had always been there, even when she couldn't, even when she let a man define it for her. And now she had found it again, or perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had truly found it. 3 months after Derek moved out, Elena's phone rang on a Tuesday evening as she was preparing her lesson plan for the next day's class. A name she hadn't seen in 90 days appeared on the screen. She answered with a calmness that surprised even herself. No racing heart, no trembling hands, just the mild curiosity of someone turning a page in a book they had finished long ago. Derek's voice on the other end of the line was different, and it took Elena a few seconds to realize where the difference lay. Then she understood. The confidence was gone. The charm had vanished. All the glamorous layers he had painstakingly built over so many years had been cruelly stripped bare by 3 months of paying his own bills. What remained was just the voice of a man who had been forced to face the reality that the world owed him nothing. I just wanted to say, I get it now. What you did for me, what you paid for, what you sacrificed. I never thanked you, not once in 4 years, and I'm sorry for that, Derek said, and Elena heard a slight tremble in his voice that she had never heard before, the tremble of a man forced, for the first time in his life, to say an apology he actually meant. Elena was silent for a moment, not because she was searching for the right words, but because she wanted this moment to settle deeply. She wanted to feel its full meaning before she replied. Then she said in a voice that was soft but in no way weak, "Thank you for saying that. Could we? Could we try again? I know I destroyed everything, but I can rebuild it. We can rebuild it. It'll be different this time. This time, I'll be the one paying the bills," Derek said. And in his voice was a fragile sliver of hope, the last hope of a man who had lost everything and was trying to grab onto anything that might save him. "No, Derek, we can't," Elena replied, and she was surprised by how easily the words left her lips. There was no inner conflict, no hesitation, just a simple truth spoken with all the peace of someone who had found the answer for herself. "But I don't hate you. I never hated you, and I think that's what's important. I'm just no longer responsible for you." And that, honestly, is a profound relief. Derek hung up after a long silence that Elena made no attempt to fill. She placed her phone down on the table, and for the first time in 5 years she felt no guilt about anything. No guilt for leaving, no guilt for refusing, no guilt for choosing herself over a man who had never chosen her. And the feeling was as light as a feather drifting in the wind. One spring afternoon, about half a year after all these events, Elena and I sat in our old coffee shop on Flanders Street, the place where we had first met, and also where she had told me this entire story. Outside the window, the old maple trees were growing new leaves after a long, damp winter. Tender green buds were bursting forth under the weak late afternoon sun. Elena looked out that window with her deep brown eyes, eyes I had now learned to read, and I saw in them no more sorrow, only a profound peace, like the surface of a lake after a storm. "Do you know what the strangest thing is?" she asked me, and I knew it wasn't a question that needed an answer. It was an invitation to step into her inner world one last time before this story truly closed. When he told me I wasn't in his league, when he said I didn't belong in his world, I believed him. I really did. Not because it was true, but because I was used to thinking of myself as less than others. I was trained to think that way since I was a child, from watching my mother bow her head to my father whenever he raised his voice, even though she was the pillar of the family. From learning that women should be humble, should be yielding, should be supportive, should stand in the background. But I've come to understand something. Humility doesn't mean making yourself someone else's shadow. Humility is knowing your worth and not needing to shout about it. And support doesn't mean letting someone stand on your shoulders only to turn around and tell you, "You're small." She turned to look at me, and in that moment, I saw all the versions of Elena from throughout this story converge in that gaze. The young girl who believed love was endurance, the wife who spent 4 years building someone else's dream, the woman who stood behind a glass door and overheard the entire truth of her life, and the person sitting before me now. The person who had walked through all of it and was still here, still smiling, still drinking black tea with no sugar, still teaching accounting for free to immigrant women every Wednesday night. A person's worth isn't in what others call them. It's not in what class placed it in. It's not in their bank account balance or the title on their business card, she said, and her voice wasn't loud, but every word was as clear as a raindrop on a glass roof. A person's worth lies in their ability to stand tall without needing anyone's permission, to look in the mirror every morning and know that they don't have to prove anything to anyone. And once you can do that, no one can ever take it away from you again. Not Derek, not any man, not this entire world. I said nothing more because I knew that statement needed no commentary from me. It stood on its own 2 feet, just like the woman who had just uttered it. And in that moment, I realized I had just witnessed something rare in this life. I had just witnessed the moment a human being truly understood her own worth. And that moment was more beautiful than any apology, more beautiful than any revenge, more beautiful than any happy ending Hollywood could ever write. I don't know who you are, the person listening to this story right now. Maybe you're sitting alone in a dimly lit room after a long, tiring day. Maybe you're driving on an empty highway with the radio off and only this voice filling the car. Maybe you're cooking dinner in the kitchen, your phone propped up on the counter, one earbud loosely in place. And I don't know what your story is, but I know that you've stayed until now. You've listened to Elena's entire story from beginning to end. And that means something in this story has resonated with you, has touched a place deep inside that perhaps even you haven't yet given a name. Maybe you're in a relationship where you are always always the one staying, always the one filling the voids that others leave behind. And you've asked yourself so many times when what you give will finally be seen, when the balance sheet of your life will finally be even. And I want you to know that that question isn't selfish, it's human. And you have the right to ask it. You have the right to demand an answer. Maybe you've been treated as temporary, as a means to an end, as a stepping stone, a rest stop on someone else's journey, and you believed it. You've shrunk yourself to fit into the box they put you in. You stayed silent because you thought silence was strength, when in fact, it was slowly making you invisible. And I want you to know that you are not temporary. You were never temporary. And just because someone else couldn't see your value doesn't mean it wasn't there. Or maybe you have, accidentally or intentionally, treated someone as if they exist only to serve your purpose. Maybe you've taken someone's kindness for granted without once saying thank you. Maybe you've categorized people on invisible ladders, like I used to do before I met Elena. And if that's true, then I want you to know that it's not too late. It's not too late to look back, to acknowledge it, to change. Because admitting you were wrong isn't weakness. Admitting you were wrong is the only way to keep yourself from becoming the Derek in someone else's story. I'm telling you Elena's story, not so you'll hate Derek, because hating someone you don't even know is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And Derek isn't a demon. Derek is the product of a way of thinking that existed long before he was born. The way of thinking that says people can be ranked like products in a supermarket, that some are born to be on top while others are born to be at the bottom, that a person's value is determined by social status, by their bank balance, by the title printed on their business card. And that way of thinking doesn't come from an individual. It comes from an entire system of stories we've been telling each other for hundreds of years. Created fairy tales about princes and servants, from Hollywood movies about winners and losers, from the invisible lessons we absorb when we're too young to know how to fight back. But you can stop telling that story today, right now. You can look at the person next to you, no matter who they are, no matter what they do for a living, no matter how much money is in their account, or how many letters are after their name, and you can see a human being, nothing more, nothing less. A human being whose value doesn't need to be proven. A human being who has the right to be respected, not because they've done something great, but simply because they exist in this world. And the moment you can do that, the moment you truly see another person without any filters, is the moment you also begin to see yourself. And if you are Elena, if you are in a relationship where you constantly have to shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations, if you are waking up every morning wondering how much longer you can endure, if you are standing behind some glass door having just heard the entire truth about your life from the mouth of the person you have loved and sacrificed for, then I want you to know one thing. One thing that took Elena 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars to learn, but that you don't have to pay such a high price for. Your value does not lie in whether others recognize it. It does not lie in whether someone is willing to stay with you. It is not in the numbers on your paycheck or the praise on social media. It is there. It has always been there. It has been there since the day you were born, and it will be there until the day you leave this world. And one day, you will stop trying to prove it. You will stop seeking validation from others. You will simply live with it. Like your breath, like your heartbeat, like the blood flowing in your veins. And that will be the day you are truly free. Free not because you left someone, but because you found yourself. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. And I know it's long. I know it requires patience in a world where everything is designed to be shorter and faster. 15-second videos, 100-character status updates, the constant notifications pulling you from the present moment. But some lessons can't be wrapped up in 15 seconds. Some truths need time to soak into your skin, like rain seeping into the earth after a long drought. And I hope that after spending nearly an hour listening to Elena's story, you have found something for yourself. A question, an answer, or maybe just the feeling that you are not alone on this journey. If this story resonated with you, if it touched a place you've kept hidden for a long time, then please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Not to teach them, not to show them where they went wrong or how they should change, but simply to let them know that they are not alone. That a woman named Elena walked this path and managed to stand up again, and if she could do it, then they can too. And if you are the one standing at a crossroads right now, between staying in an unfair relationship and stepping out of it, between the familiar safety of what is known and the vague fear of what is unknown, then I can't tell you what to do. I don't have that right. No one has that right except you. But I can tell you this, and I say it with all the sincerity of someone who has seen too many people stay for too long just because they thought the time invested was a good enough reason to continue. The time that has passed is not a reason to continue. The time that has passed is just time that has passed. It is not an investment you need to recover. It is not a promise you need to keep. It is simply the days that have gone by and will never return. And the real question isn't how long you've stayed, but whether you want to stay even one more day. Remember the words that the lawyer, Miriam Okonkwo, said to Elena in that small office in Northeast Portland that afternoon. The words Elena recounted to me with tear-filled eyes and a slow voice as if every word was etched into her memory. Silence is not an obligation. Silence is a gift, and you have the right to stop giving it whenever you want. I'll see you in the next story. And until then, I hope you will be kind to yourself, because you deserve it, even if you don't believe it yet.